This panel a rather large topic to cover, which sort of brings together all of the applications and sort of outlines the roadmap, but I'm sure they're up to it. So it's my pleasure to introduce Louis Kent. Louis is an energy scientist and economist with over 10 years experience consulting predominantly to the mining sector. And last year he crossed the fence from consulting to industry and is now with BHP in the low emissions technology team, where he's been leading the studies assessing decarbonisation of material movement and electricity supply, working with colleagues across Australia and Chile.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Adrian, and thanks for all having me. So what an inspiring day we've had so far. It's great to see the breadth and depth of interest and enthusiasm to find ways to deploy green hydrogen throughout the industry. And after all of the exciting presentations we've had today, we have the good fortune of following all of that inspiration with a discussion on economics and business fundamentals. Now, I'm not sure if you're all like me, and when you hear you're about to be exposed to economics, you instantly become alert and engaged like you've just had a double espresso. But just in case some in the audience don't have the same reaction, I thought I'd start by setting the tone of this chat a little bit. So the idea isn't to get bogged down in today's economics, but rather look ahead. Consider things like carbon cost, product stewardship or green commodities, oil price volatility, social and employee expectations, and try to understand the expectations of the people that have the money or want to buy the products, and what is involved in meeting those expectations, and how you might maximise the chances of success, but in a pragmatic way that acknowledges the realities of what financiers and customers actually need. Unfortunately, we have a wonderful group of people here to discuss all of those things with a lot of relevant experience. So the format, as I understand it, is to move our way around the couches and allow people to give a brief introduction to themselves, and then we'll jump into our questions. So I'll pass over to Gordon.
Gordon Rees from an associate at Energetics, and we're a small specialist consultancy providing advice to clients on issues to do with climate change strategy and energy strategy.
Matt Walden from ARENA, and for those who aren't familiar, ARENA is the Commonwealth Government's Renewable Energy Agency, primarily a grant-making or grant-funding organisation with a mandate around renewables, of which renewable hydrogen firmly fits into. It's one of our investment priorities. I'm an investment director in the organisation with responsibility for our investment activities in the renewable hydrogen space.
My name is Rob Wilson with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We're Australia's green bank, established in 2012 with $10 billion of commitments. So the task really was to accelerate the transformation of energy in Australia. At the moment, I think we have around $6.5 billion of that has been committed. We've now started recycling, and obviously green hydrogen clearly falls into that mandate. It's pretty early on in the green hydrogen investment space, so I'm a bit envious of the technical guys and their clarity on the technical side of things. But I think there's a lot to talk about, and look forward to having the conversation here.
Peter Ross from the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility. I'm not sure if I'm viewed as the ugly sister. On the government funding side, but we have a mandate to provide up to $5 billion of finance across Northern Australia, and it's a infrastructure-wide mandate, so we're agnostic in terms of what sort of projects we're supporting in that regard, but we do work closely potentially with both CFC and ARENA.
David Leitch. My main fame is for asking embarrassing questions to people, but over and beyond that, I'm an research analyst, and now I run a very small consultancy, 2 people. We forecast electricity prices mainly in the east. If you want to know what we think the solar weighted price will be next quarter, or how many new projects will be energised in 18 months' time, that's the sort of thing we do, and analyse projects I've got a long background in working on IPOs and equity capital markets and stuff.
Thank you. So now we get to jump into the questions, and I haven't warned the panel of this, but I thought I might shake up some of the order, because I started looking through the questions and thought that some of them might be putting the cart before the horse. So I thought I'll jump down to question 3, and seeing as we've got a few of the government bodies on the table, the questions are, what do the different government finance bodies play, what role do they play in enabling new technologies, and what are the current expectations in terms of supporting hydrogen projects? So I guess, yeah, we'll jump over to the government bodies to begin with.
Yes, so from ARENA's perspective, that's very much in our focus. I mean, ARENA's mandate is on renewable energy and technologies that support that energy transition. The technology focus is an interesting one for us, and I think quite broad. I mean, everything we do needs to have a very firm commercialisation story, and I think that feeds in quite well with Rob's position from the point of view of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, where ARENA's job is really to understand the technology, what the commercialisation potential is, to then unlock that benefit. And I think fair to say if that commercialisation potential wasn't there, there'd probably limited interest in ARENA supporting that activity. I think one of the prime examples, probably drawing those parallels back to the large-scale solar environment, where there was that opportunity to drive cost reduction in Australia and to bring that technology to its commercial readiness, which then obviously suited quite well to Rob and Peter's organisations being able to finance those technologies going forward. ARENA's able to step back and focus on things like renewable hydrogen. So from our point of view, it is really getting to understand the technical challenges of new technologies, but equally to further understand and have a very cohesive story around that commercialisation potential.
Can I jump in and just ask, but I realise this is probably something that you could write a thesis on, but can you give a bit more detail on what commercialisation trajectory means to people in the audience? Like what are the goalposts? What sort of a trajectory do they need to
Yeah, Lewis, I mean, jokingly, it's quite easy. It's to do ourselves out of a job. It is really to have that credible story to say, here's a logical pathway to not requiring ARENA or government subsidy, or however you want to term it, but having a credible pathway to not needing that investment to allow these technologies to succeed on their own.
Great, thanks.
So from the CDFC perspective, our goal really is to accelerate the transformation. We're very much a purely commercial focused organisation. We do tend to work quite closely with ARENA, so if we're getting stuff that is too early in that it's still being commercialised, it's not proven technologies, we will have a conversation with ARENA, and they will then take a look at it from that perspective. Part of our goal is to develop the investability of the new energy sector. So we're really trying to incentivise the large financial organisations to come into the market, and we do that by really trying to play at the front end, first in the market. So your banks are typically, they don't want to be doing a first in the market. They'll do anything providing it's not first in the market. So our job is to get out there and try and lead them into areas. And we typically are looking to, for every dollar we put in, we're trying to get $2 or $3 of commercial funding alongside us to do that. We don't do grants. We're looking for a return on capital. Historically, it's been largely in the debt space, a lot of project finance type stuff, which tends to be more complicated and at the bigger end. So typically, we wouldn't want to be putting less than $20 million into something, but upwards to 200 as well. Although we do now have an equity capability, and we have a small innovation fund that's very much focused on clean tech, which sort of crosses over a bit into the sort of more advanced end of where ARENA would be playing. But we worked together. I think DeGrussa was a project where ARENA put in a slice of capital, which I think is recoupable ultimately. But essentially they put in risk capital, we put in debt alongside them to help get the DeGrussa renewable project away. I think does that cover where you're wanting to go with that?
I think it does a pretty good job. Does anyone else want to add anything on that point?
Yeah, just so from a NAIF perspective, I guess our mandate is slightly different in that ours is a broad infrastructure mandate, and it's really primarily aimed at supporting economic growth and population growth in the north, which roughly the top half of Australia, which has 6% of the population. So if we sort of think of that in the context of what that would mean in this room, for example, half a dozen people occupying half this room and everyone else down the end. It's so we're there to do that. We, in a sense, we sort of sit slightly between on a return basis between ARENA and CEFC, because ARENA can obviously provide grants or provide funding to help make a project work that doesn't have to be repaid. CEFC generally has a market-based return requirement. What we've been given is a mandate that can provide concessions, and those can really be across several areas. It can be across low interest rates, longer tenors, and to some extent more risk appetite. So we have the opportunity to actually dovetail with both ARENA and CEFC for certain projects, and hydrogen may be one of those areas.
I'd just like to jump in and quickly point out in regard to the previous conversation that I guess I don't have a resource industry background, but I'm shocked when I see cost of equity in projects around 14%. I mean, from a theory perspective, you need an equity beta, if that means anything to anyone here, of about like 2 or something like that, which is a ridiculous number for a very well-established technology like solar and wind, which is most of the cost of the hydrogen manufacturing. In the utility side of things, where you talk about cost of equity, like the cost of debt is 2%, and an equity risk premium of 6% would get you to 8% absolute max, and I would argue that the beta for the actual solar and wind part, if you could separate that out, is less than 1. So really return on equity somewhere between 6 and 8%. I know that project proponents are reluctant to accept that and for finance it, but that's what the textbook tells you. And it's important when you look at the LCOE calculations that you put up there. It makes a big difference to the cost of solar and wind electricity if you put in what I regard as more realistic cost of equity.
Anything to add on that one? So, thanks, Paul. The next question kind of fits in nicely because it's around what type of unique applications and projects could enable commercialisation. I realise that the background and focus of the people on the panel is different, so maybe there will be some people that will step back from this one, but Gordon, do you want to start?
Maybe if I can jump in first, because it's a very interesting question, because I know everybody here is interested in the use of hydrogen and more broadly other renewable technologies in the mining sector. But for me, it's great. Mining has a number of unique challenges, one of which is the very high cost of electricity and fuel in remote applications. And a lot of the applications that have been discussed today have been around that. But the volume is orders of magnitude less than some of the ones that were talked earlier, like Alison Reeve, when she was up here, talked about the applications in broader society that can't be electrified. We're also looking at hydrogen as a means of firming power generation. And those applications, they don't talk in terms of megawatts, they talk in terms of gigawatts of capacity. So you can argue that those areas are the ones that are really going to drive down the cost of all renewables, including hydrogen, as they did with wind and solar. However, mining applications, as Warner indicated in his very interesting presentation, stand on their own 2 feet now, whereas you can't say the same thing for use of hydrogen in the broader economy. So you could say that mining has a unique opportunity to lead the world in demonstrating the technology, but it'll be the rest of society that will really drive down the cost.
Sorry if I missed in there, but what sorts of applications are there? Because with hydrogen, the different applications value hydrogen differently. So whether it's industrial feedstock or for mobility or for electricity or for storage, they all have different values associated with them. And also they require different supply chains. So supply chain of getting it to high pressure includes more complexity, more cost, and more energy consumption in delivering it to the final gigajoules or the output that you're seeking. Of course, the dream result would be to have the highest value application match up with the lowest cost supply, but I suspect that's probably not the case. Where does that spread maximise?
So you mean which application now would?
Yeah, or emerging applications.
Well, it looks as though it's transport that's leading, because we have got a number, and discussed in the earlier session, examples of transport applications. And we know that Japan and Korea are pushing very hard for fuel cell electric vehicles, whereas for very good reasons, whereas a lot of the other parts of the world are pushing for battery electric vehicles for light vehicles. So you can say transport is looking like a very good initial application.
In the mining sector?
Well, okay, in the mining sector would be, I would suggest, it's a difficult one because we know hydrogen can work in power generation because all the bits already exist. But we've had a number of the speakers indicate pushback from the suppliers of mining fleet to say we haven't got a 300-tonne dump truck that's driven by a hydrogen fuel cell. So it may well be remote power simply because that technology is available off the shelf, if you like, whereas a mining fleet is not available off the shelf.
Yeah, I guess that's another good point. Outside of the economics, it's the ease of implementation and risk. So.
I think that risk point's interesting one. I think that's come up in each of the discussions this morning, and it probably gives a bit of an insight into how we look at investment proposals in this sector as well. Particularly in the mining sector, I think what we're talking about here is really critical service. Another area we do a bit of work in, for example, is the wastewater treatment sector, where again there's that reluctance to move away from an incumbent due to that risk of a critical service. So where we try to think about our investment in this space is understanding what is that risk that ARENA is there to either share, mitigate, reduce, or otherwise manage to allow a technology or an opportunity to progress. And in the mining sector, for example, it may well be that retaining redundancy is a way of doing that, and what that then needs is potentially ARENA or NAVE from a concessionality point of view is to support that deployment to allow the technology to be de-risked on site, whilst giving the operator or the owner of that facility the confidence that there is that redundancy there. And that's a pathway we've seen in other sectors that have allowed new technologies to move into that space, because again, as I said, critical services disrupting business usual operations is an extremely sensitive area.
Just maybe a slightly different take. I think it comes down to why you're looking at it. So if the premise is decarbonisation, and clearly battery EVs don't have the energy density, for heavy use. So in mining, I think that's probably one of the critical factors, is that hydrogen holds the potential for decarbonising your fleet in a way that you're not going to achieve in too many other ways. I think, as an early adopter, the other issue here is how do you roll out the infrastructure in a way that you can get these trials going. And clearly closed loop type systems is a big part of it. So where you've got a haul fleet or a truck fleet that is doing circular type loops, you can have a very simple sort of infrastructure rollout. So practically a hell of a lot easier, I think.
I might throw the next one to David, if that's all right. This one was, the question as it's written is, what is required to get hydrogen down to the cost level that it needs to be for mines? Now, we've probably heard some comments today that maybe in some areas it is at that level, in other areas it's got further to go, and there's always the point of view element to that as well. So, David, do you want to start on what things may be there, if any, others that need to come down, and where it needs to get to?
As far as the use of hydrogen in mines, the first thing I want to say is I don't regard myself as very knowledgeable on the topic. That's the truth of the matter. I was looking at the ARENA ACIL costings for producing hydrogen on a large scale. And of course the first thing you run into is unit conversions, where everything in hydrogen is quoted in per kilogram. Well, I mean, last time I put a kilogram of petrol in the car, can't remember what it cost, but you know. As far as I can see, the forecast is for the landed cost of hydrogen in Japan to be around about $38 a gigajoule Aussie in about 2025, assuming the electrolyser cost comes down about 50 or 60%, which is a smaller part of the cost. And of that $38 a gigajoule, which of course compares with an LNG cost, I don't know, what's $14 a gigajoule or something, about half of that cost is transport, you know, liquefaction and compression transport and stuff. So the actual underlying cost of producing hydrogen on a mine site at a smaller scale is probably something around the order of $17 a gigajoule, which is still substantially higher, certainly than the cost of natural gas before you take the transport cost into account. But may be comparable in circumstances we just saw with the diesel cost. I mean, so there's no doubt that on the mine site the solar cost is going to work for you. Battery cost, if you're using battery, we already know that's coming down about 20% a year itself as a result of scale. So the question, I guess, is where else can you get learning rates in the use of hydrogen? We know the electrolyser is going to come down at a rate of knots, we can forecast that, but I think for broader use, particularly for stuff like the Northwest project that CWP is promoting, it's getting the cost of transport down would be fantastically helpful, and I don't know what the prospects are there.
Can I put a comment as well, because you asked about what's required to get the price down. But it's really interesting, there was a comment that was made in the previous session about that the PEM electrolyzers is a very established technology, and so there's unlikely to be advances in the fundamental chemistry of it. However, it's got potentially manufactured in orders of magnitude larger scale, so price will come down as a result of skill in manufacturing. But you can also read in the technical literature that work is still being done in chemistry laboratories on fundamentally different electrolysis chemistry, by going to acid instead of alkali for types of electrolysis, new types of electrodes. So if you're also tackling the chemistry, so it may come up with fundamentally different electrolyzers which are more efficient, who knows what's going to happen to the price?
Maybe just to add to that, I mean, you know, cost curve produced this morning by the Minister as forecast showed a significant drop-off, which is interesting because in the context of people saying that it's energy cost and that electrolysers don't have a lot of scope for reduction other than through scale of actual production, that raises the question of, you know, where does that cost curve come from? And when you think about just using hydrogen as a fuel, for example, you've really got to look at that cost in a relative sense to other fuels, because that's what you're competing with. And when people talk, you know, there was a couple of mentions today about first mover advantage. You know, I guess I'd challenge that and say, would you actually expect to get first mover advantage? If we look at the history with PV cells, for example, there's people out there who have had the pleasure of paying, you know, 10 times what someone might pay today. So I don't think they would say they had a first mover advantage. And, you know, it does come back to how do you actually create a scenario for people? Are you just going to wait until you have price competitiveness that moves people to pursue it, or is it something which is not in our remit to talk about, but in terms of policy driven? You know, if you think about renewable energy, I guess you would ask, how much renewable energy we have in Australia today if we hadn't had those policies around solar panels, around all sorts of things, RECs and everything. Where would we be? And I guess, you know, if people want to look at hydrogen, certainly the Minister Swan was very keen on it, you know, where does that go from a policy perspective as opposed to just waiting for the economics to work? Just one other quick point on that. I mean, you know, when Warmer presented his slides earlier, we saw the hydrogen was scenario 45. So you're talking about when people are looking at energy for mines and things like that, you know, there are so many options out there, and so it's very hard to necessarily get, you know, to get into a project. But at the moment, when you look at projects like solar and wind, where it's very much high capital cost, low operating cost, and hydrogen, it's probably slightly different to that, but is like that if you're working off renewable energy, that it's actually a very good time for investment just because of low interest rates and that environment we have today compared to 10 or 20 years ago.
Just add a comment there. I think Warner's presentation actually, you know, brought out one of the aspects that probably a lot of us haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, and it's how much energy is actually wasted due to curtailment. And certainly on the East Coast, curtailment's quite a big issue in renewables. And when you get into sort of mini microgrids for mines and things like that, if you're wanting to push to a fairly high level of renewables, you're going to end up with overcapacity type situations. So that curtailment is a real issue, and you'd effectively almost be getting your renewable energy then for free. So you know, when you look at the economics, that's a bit of a tenuous argument, but it certainly brings a different angle to the hydrogen debate, I think.
If I can just dig into that bit a little bit further, and feel free to all chip in, but on the concept of having free energy available during curtailment, and Gordon pointed out technology may evolve and things will be very different, but at the moment the hydrogen production capex, the investment in that equipment, you're investing that capex and then you want to use that equipment at a fairly high utilisation. I think the CSIRO forecast that you mentioned before assumes a utilisation of about 90% or so of that equipment. Now, if you're relying on the times of curtailment, we're going to need to be significantly over-investing in generation capacity to have 90% of the time having curtailed energy. It may happen, but just wondering about that connection there about you've got the high capex, need that high utilisation, and it also flows into a bit of a delineation between, for consumers, if they're on the one hand buying hydrogen from somewhere where all of that's optimised, or if they're buying electricity and making hydrogen, or if they're off-grid and they're making electricity and making hydrogen, in which case you need to provide that reliability to get that high utilisation fully self-sufficiently.
Maybe if I can kick off. I mean, our clients are not asking us about hydrogen, but they're asking us about batteries. And we've got economic models that look at coupling batteries and solar PV. And it's just building on what Louis said. You can make a battery work behind the meter if there happen to be an excess of solar panels. But the moment you have to put in solar panels to charge up a battery, on current prices it just doesn't work. So in a sense, it's rare to find, at least in a microgrid, free surplus energy, because what you require is significant variation in demand from one time of day to another time of day, and you're planning to meet peak demand with say your solar. Now things like that happen in networks, but unfortunately they tend not to happen in mine sites, which generally have one or two major loads that are fairly steady. So you may find that, at least with current prices, it is challenging to find a mine site where you can justify putting in a lot of excess solar panels and wind turbines to charge or to generate hydrogen.
sounds like batteries are a good way to monetize other people's sunk costs.
Just quickly answer that one, because that's something we're very much turning our mind to at the moment. And that's a question of today versus a hypothetical scenario around material cost reduction in electrolyzer technologies. So we've got projects going at the moment that are either about to start or will be starting shortly that really look at how does electrolyzer technology or hydrogen production more generally work in terms of direct couple behind the meter solar, grid connected, versus a dedicated renewable generation facility with wind, solar and some form of storage that then has the ability to participate in high price events in the market to provide a lower cost of electricity back to that facility. So I think it's a really interesting one, and I think under the lens of today, I think the numbers wouldn't look all that great, but if you think about that in a future scenario, and again, drawing on some of Warner's comments around that future cost reduction, and I think McKinsey had some interesting information during the week as well about that. If you can realise those reductions in the electrolyser technology, then some of these alternate scenarios around curtailed energy do come into play.
And I just add that the trend in the solar industry, as I understand it, is very much that the solar panels cost is reducing far faster than any other component, to the point where it's now a relatively minor part of a typical utility solar project. And so what we're seeing is the DC to AC ratio going up and up from what used to be like about 1.2 up to about ratios as high as 2 I've seen mentioned. And then the idea is you can use that 2 ratio, you will get some spilled energy that you can shove into some form of storage, where I guess 8 out of 10 people think battery today, but hydrogen is the alternative.
Absolutely. Now we'll lift our eyes across the horizon a bit and interested to get our experts' view of the potential role for international finance in domestic hydrogen projects for mines.
I'm going to defer to people who I'm sure speak to international financiers, but so I'll just start off with a fairly amateur comment that when you look at Japan and South Korea, they've clearly shown a lot of interest in hydrogen one way or another, and I suspect there'll be some international money out there for the right sort of project, but there are very, very few projects in Australia at the moment. It's pretty hard to invest because we haven't proved we can do it yet.
I think, personally, I think international capital is going to play quite an important role in this, and we as I was saying earlier, I think that first in the market is a real issue. So I'm aware of a project that we've been involved with where we effectively cornerstoned a raising. All the other investors were international, and it's not well known. We probably can't say much more about it, but that's kind of the role, is to get the first in the market out there. The internationals were waiting for a local investor to come along. They see us in that instance as government as well, so that sort of helped crowd it in. Subsequent to that, the particular sector that investment is in has now attracted attention from the banks, and they're sort of moving into it. So internationally, there are pools of capital that understand the risks. They're already doing it in other places. It may not be in the full, the full supply chain that we're talking about, but they understand how to price that risk, and they're keen to do it. Whereas our capital markets are sort of smaller and more conservative.
Maybe just one final comment. For the 230 odd years that modern Australia has been in existence, we've been an importer of capital every year. So what will be any different about hydrogen?
It's a good way to wrap that one up. If you want more jokes out of Gordon, he likes a good drop of red wine, and we've got 2 more questions left before we throw to audience Q&A. Is that all right time-wise? So what sort of, this is probably what everyone's here to really hear, what sort of financial incentives and grants are available for mines or suppliers that want to be first to market?
So I'll start with the cheapest form of capital first. So from ARENA's point of view, I think I stressed early on that hydrogen as a subject matter area firmly aligns with our investment priorities. The key things that we look at when we see any proposal in the space is really what's the long-term story behind us supporting an activity of that nature. ATCO spoke earlier this morning, and again, a very helpful partnership there that's released a lot of information into the market about what they're trying to do and what are the barriers they're looking to break down. But equally out of that, it will start to answer the what next. So what role can hydrogen play at high blend levels in the pipelines? And again, I appreciate this isn't quite the mining sector at the moment, but everything we do needs to have a cohesive story about the what next, so that when we do support and start that commercialization journey for these technologies, there is the role for us or Arena to step back and say, yeah, our job's done here, and it's over to the likes of Rob and Peter from other financing elements and international and local financiers to take that to greater scale.
And maybe just to add on that, in terms of what we have is obviously an ability to really bring down the cost of capital. And David was talking about the sort of return levels that potentially people might want on projects, particularly if they're greenfield projects and their resource projects, which, you know, ultimately is the risk you take. And if you're building a hydrogen plant that's going to supply a mine or something like that, then being able to do much longer tenor, for example, really brings down that potential cost of capital. So that's, you know, to my mind, the real driver. And obviously, in mining projects, it is a consideration as well in terms of how much capital you need. And looking at a project where you need to make a big capital investment for your power solution can actually drive people to that trade-off of wanting to spend less because it's less money you have to raise, etc. So there's broader considerations of just the straight return and the security as well, which got mentioned this morning in terms of do you have access to someone who can fix a hydrolyzer or whatever you might have a problem with.
It's worth mentioning, we talked about mine life a lot of times. It's also the creditworthiness of the mine owner and mine operator. For if you want to get your cost of capital down, you know, the ability of the customer to pay is always very helpful. And when you're talking to the banks, I guess that's the another point I want to make. It's a long claims line a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can shed a whole lot more light on cheap capital, I guess, but what we're already trying to do, you know, we heard the Minister this morning talk about the fact that 40% of WA's emissions come out of the mining sector. So we're really trying to work out how we play in that space. Electricity generation is a big part of that, so trying to get renewables into it is already something we're really focusing on. You can go down project finance, which is really complex and reserved for big deals. So, you know, how else do you play? We believe that the independent power producers play quite a big role in this. They are already taking these sort of risks on mining companies. The challenge with renewables, obviously, is that you are looking at longer-term assets, you know, typically 15 to 25-year lives. So, you know, you need a minimum sort of 10-year contract period, and we think at 10 years that renewables will generate an above 10% return, and at a 15 you get an even better level if you can get a reasonable, well that's based on sort of a diesel substitution type, you know, revenue stream. So that's part of the equation heading into hydrogen. So hydrogen, you've got exactly the same. You're putting long life assets out there on mines. If it's going to be renewable driven, it's really about the renewable assets that are sitting out there that generally don't have reportability of the other assets. So, you know, one needs to find solutions to bridge that asset portability aspect. And my suspicion is that the way to start is with the longer life projects initially, and then, you know, you can work out if the IPPs are able to start taking those risks around portability on things like wind and solar ultimately.
Sorry, the other point I want to make is just that when we look at the example of solar, which is a fantastic example of how Arena was able to catalyse. That was a matter of opportunity, that the global example was already in front of Australia, in front of ARENA when they did that funding round. The world, led by Germany and following up on China, was already bringing the cost of utility scale solar down at an incredible rate of knots. It was just a matter of translating that into Australia. I think if you take the hydrogen example, Australia on its own is unlikely to bring the cost of electrolysis down massively all by itself. We have to go broadly at the same speed as the rest of the world for a brand new technology like this, or at least that's what I think when it comes to financing.
Right, now we've got one last question, which is a brief one before moving to audience Q&A. Time to dust off your crystal balls. When is hydrogen expected to be available for large-scale adoption to mines as a viable, economic, low-carbon fuel option?
I think Gordon should go first.
I was promised no difficult questions.
We'll assume all the caveats under the sun.
Maybe 2030.
Okay.
I'm going to maybe be slightly more optimistic. I'd say 2025. I do think there's a really meaningful argument for, I suppose, deployment at a lesser scale at the moment. And I would like to see the mining sector particularly start to look at remote area power. Again, and I think one of the speakers in one of the early sessions, around some of the auxiliary elements of mining where you can have redundancy built in. So I think that's the logical next step that needs to happen before you can have a cohesive story for that bigger scale.
I think it's probably all been said. So it does sound as though your projections are saying around 2025 in terms of the cost structures. From a project financing perspective, it's really going to be a case of getting the financiers comfortable with the bankability of an integrated project, as it were. But I think there are parties out there doing this already, and I've certainly seen one project. It's not a mining project, but it is hydrogen for transport, where the equity return is starting to approach a level that would be financeable. Now, we haven't sort of delved into assumptions and all the rest, but it's obviously still got a way to go from that perspective. But I think the mid-20s is probably that.
Okay.
I don't have a firm view on when it will be. I saw the figure of 2023 this morning, which I thought was optimistic, although people are out there making meaningful steps and looking at pilot plants, etc. I think we have been very focused on the ability to produce and what we might do, as opposed to seeing it being pulled by what we might use it for. And I think identifying what it is that we might use it for, whether it be just as a fuel or whether it be to reduce harm or make ammonia, that'll really be the driver to me to when it gets up. I mean, the reason you always hear it talked about in the context of remote area power is because that is the most expensive generally, and therefore the first place you can look to displace diesel and the like. And we're seeing more and more of that with solar and batteries, but obviously there's physical limitations there as to how much you can integrate those sorts of things. So I think it will go hand in hand with identifying exactly what we're going to use it for.
I don't know, we saw that it's very close to added value in certain mining sites at the moment, and I'd say any mining project that I was thinking along those lines should be often talking to ARENA and CEFC, and no doubt be a lot more possible than it was before you talked to them. If you've got a decent mine with a decent life, you could probably do it right now with their help. I would suspect ARENA would be really, really keen to find a project to invest in to show it can be done. But for me, it's all about the big export opportunity, big scale projects, and that's going to need people like CWP to sign up with someone like Japan or South Korea to on a big project. But the economics for that, I think, are still a few years away. At least I don't know. I hesitate to say.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, and we've got a bit of time for audience Q&A, so I hope you have some questions. There was definitely a lot of interesting content covered there.
Thank you. Jamie from HDU. Just following from that last point, I guess. Rob, you mentioned affordability, which was talked about a bit along the last panel, and how the long-term assets might be the best place to start. In mining, there are long-term assets, of course. There's, say, the iron ore mines that build railways that are not movable. I think a few years ago, FNG built a gas pipeline which was funded by a 20-year, 100% take-or-pay contract. So, knowing that those commodities exist, those markets exist, those end users exist, the capital shock that was mentioned before could be spread out over a 20-year life of asset. What does the industry need to do? What does the financial industry need to do as well? Do you guys view, say, ARENA and CEFC as taking a role in developing innovative financial structures that might unlock that, or is it something that the industry needs to bring to you?
Yeah, going first, I think there's examples where we have done that already. I don't think that necessarily is the model into perpetuity, is ARENA taking mine life risk or sharing mine life risk, which it has to support demonstration. But I think, Jamie, sort of one step back from that is, where we see an opportunity in the mining sector is that interconnection of various mining systems. So if you sort of take direct off-grid versus the Northwest system, where there is huge opportunity to put in renewable assets that have multiple opportunities for energy offtake, I think that's a really exciting opportunity. I think that should be considered in isolation to say that the remote off-grid, where there is that incentive to, at the moment use diesel because your resources are circa on a 3 or 5 year rotation. And I think that's a very different proposition that might be a bit more difficult.
The context of the mine life is probably more important if you're looking at third parties financing some kind of integrated hydrogen project or renewable project for that matter. So if you've got a strong balance sheet miner who's happy to do it themselves, such as mostly done with the railways, then these things can happen really easily. I guess my context is more around if you're using third-party independent power producers to wrap a solution a bit like Warner was proposing, then the mine life's going to be pretty important around that. But I'm certainly hopeful that we'll see the likes of BHPs of the world actually doing their own projects in this and leading with demonstration projects.
Righty, do we have another question? Easy.
Hi, my name is Stefan Schaffner. I'm from ArcelorMittal Mining. I have since we're talking here about the economics and business fundamentals of hydrogen, I have the following question. At which level of the cost of energy does hydrogen produced on site at a mine site become cheaper than diesel?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's about $5 a kilogram or something.
Well, obviously, I think the first thing you have to say is where is the mine site? When we talk about remote, that is the real driver. What is the delivered cost of diesel, and that is what drives other opportunities, be it solar plus battery, LNG, hydrogen. It's looking at that total chain of how do I get energy to where I need it.
We're talking about, let's say, on-grid mine. So which kind of energy tariff, would make it possible to replace diesel in the truck fleet through hydrogen?
So you're talking about using grid energy to make hydrogen?
Yeah.
You'd have to do the numbers, but I think the sort of numbers that we've seen have been proposing to, sort of 4 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour, and at, as Louis mentioned, 95% capacity factor, which implies grid connected. 4 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour implies behind the meter solar without any firming. So, I think that's the challenge, and my suspicion is that is not going to give you a diesel equivalent cost.
Can I say something, Ben, maybe to help answer that question? Just a rough thumbs up rule. Diesel at $1.50 a litre is about the equivalent of hydrogen at about $12 to $13 a kilogram. And when your input cost from your renewables is about $40 a megawatt hour, you can be producing that hydrogen at a 70% capacity factor at around $4.50 a kilogram. So $4.50 a kilogram as your output hydrogen from your electrolyzer, and then to match that on the diesel price would be up to $13 a kilogram, so that's your compression, your transport. Obviously, that would be limited if it was used on site, but that gives you a bit of an idea, more or less an idea. So it can happen today.
Warner, I think if you can deliver diesel for $1.50 a litre to people in the pool, but there'll be a few people keen to talk to you afterwards.
I won't make any comments there.
This is why this Asian Renewable Hub project is such an attractive possibility, because they could potentially be producing hydrogen, and Andrew's here, at around $3.50 to $4.50 a kilogram. Diesel in that area would be more than $1.50 a litre, I would say.
I'm getting the nudge, so we better wrap up. But I'm sure you'll find these gents around in the networking session or in later days in the conference. So find them there and ask them questions. But please join me in thanking them all for their insights.